Malcolm fired me in the parking lot behind the flagship store on a Tuesday morning, his voice flat and final as he told me I was done asking questions, effective immediately, and that if I stepped foot on any of his 3 properties again, he'd have me arrested for trespassing. I stood there with my phone still warm in my hand from the email I'd just sent to the district manager about the payroll discrepancies, watching him walk back through the service entrance without turning around, and I felt the cognitive dissonance slam into me like a freight car. Was I wrong to push this far, or was silence the real betrayal? I'd worked for Malcolm for 6 years, starting as a floor associate at the flagship location in the commercial district, and eventually rising to assistant operations manager across all 3 stores. He'd built the business from a single storefront, selling outdoor equipment and apparel into a regional name. The kind of success story the local Chamber of Commerce loved to highlight at awards dinners. Malcolm had a reputation for being demanding but fair, the kind of boss who remembered your kid's name and sent flowers when your father died, and for 5.5 of those 6 years, I would have told you he deserved every bit of the loyalty his staff gave him. But in the last 6 months, something had shifted, a tectonic plate grinding beneath the surface of daily operations. And by the time I understood what was happening, the damage was already irreversible. The first crack appeared in March, when payroll came through 3 days late and Malcolm sent a terse company-wide email blaming a bank processing error. The money did arrive, but with no explanation beyond that single line. And when it happened again in April, 4 days late this time, I went to Malcolm's office to ask if we needed to address a systemic issue. He looked at me over the rim of his coffee mug and said the banks were tightening protocols, that I should focus on my own responsibilities rather than questioning his financial management, and the patronizing calm in his voice made my stomach tighten. By May, vendors started calling me directly because Malcolm had stopped returning their messages. I spent hours each week placating suppliers who were owed money for inventory that had already been sold, and one afternoon, the regional rep from our primary footwear distributor cornered me near the stockroom, his voice low and urgent as he told me his company was considering pulling our credit line because Malcolm had missed 2 consecutive payment deadlines. I pulled the accounts payable report that evening and found a labyrinth of delays, partial payments, and unexplained fund transfers. Numbers that didn't just look bad, but looked deliberately obscured, layered in a way that suggested someone was buying time or covering gaps. I brought the report to Malcolm the next morning, laying the printed pages on his desk with as much diplomacy as I could muster, and I said we needed to have a serious conversation about cash flow before vendors started refusing shipments. He didn't look at the pages. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and he asked me if I trusted him. The question hung in the air, like a trap, and I said of course I did, but that trust didn't mean ignoring warning signs, and he cut me off with a raised hand and told me he had investors handling liquidity issues and that my job was to keep the stores running, not to play accountant. I left that meeting with a cold knot in my chest because the way he'd said investors felt like a lie, wrapped in a command. The vendors weren't the only ones noticing. In early June, 2 of our best floor managers, both of whom had been with the company for over 4 years, approached me separately within the same week to say they'd been contacted by recruiters and were seriously considering leaving. When I asked why, they both gave versions of the same answer. The energy in the stores had changed. Malcolm was increasingly absent or explosive when he was present, and they didn't feel secure about the company's future. I tried to reassure them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were reading the situation more clearly than I was willing to admit. One of them, a woman named Iris who managed the second location, looked at me with something like pity and said, "You're trying to fix something that doesn't want to be fixed." The payroll issue came to a head in mid-June when the entire staff across all 3 locations went unpaid on the scheduled Friday. Malcolm sent another email blaming the bank, but this time the tone was defensive and vague. And by Monday morning, I had 7 employees in my office demanding answers I didn't have. I told them I would get to the bottom of it, and I marched into Malcolm's office without knocking, my anger finally overriding my caution, and I said we couldn't operate like this, that people had rent and mortgages, and we were about to lose half our workforce if he didn't provide transparency. He stood up from his desk, his face flushed, and he told me in a voice that shook with barely controlled rage that I had no idea what I was talking about, that he was managing pressures I couldn't comprehend, and that if I didn't trust his leadership, I could leave. I didn't leave, but I should have. Instead, I stayed because I felt a responsibility to the staff who depended on those jobs, and because some part of me still believed Malcolm would course correct if I could just find the right way to reach him. That was my mistake, confusing loyalty with enablement. And over the next month, I watched the situation metastasize. The payroll did eventually come through that week, but the damage was done. 3 employees quit outright, and the remaining staff began updating their resumes and whispering in the break room about exit strategies. Malcolm's response was to double down on control, implementing new policies that restricted manager autonomy and required his direct approval for even minor operational decisions, which created bottlenecks that slowed everything from inventory orders to customer service responses. In July, our landlord for the flagship location called me directly, which was unusual because lease matters typically went through Malcolm's attorney. The landlord, a gruff man in his 60s named Vernon, who owned half the commercial properties in the district, asked me point-blank if I knew whether Malcolm was planning to renew the lease, which was set to expire in 4 months. I told him I assumed we were renewing because Malcolm had never mentioned otherwise, and Vernon made a skeptical sound and said Malcolm hadn't responded to 3 certified letters about the renewal terms. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he had heard rumors about financial instability and that he wasn't interested in having another tenant default and leave him with a legal mess. I promised to relay the message, and when I did, Malcolm told me to tell Vernon he'd handle it directly and to stop inserting myself into matters above my pay grade. That phrase, above my pay grade, became his default response to any question that touched on finances or strategy. And it was during this period that I started to notice irregularities that went beyond cash flow problems. Shipments would arrive that didn't match our purchase orders, expensive inventory would disappear from the stockroom without corresponding sales records, and Malcolm began insisting that certain financial documents be kept in his personal office rather than in our shared management files. When I asked our bookkeeper, a meticulous woman named Denise who'd been with the company since the beginning, if she'd noticed anything unusual, she gave me a long look and said she'd been excluded from most of the financial reporting for the past 2 months, and that Malcolm had hired an outside accounting firm to handle the books. She said it quietly, like she was afraid of being overheard. And then she told me she'd started looking for other work because she didn't want her name attached to whatever was coming. The breaking point arrived in early August, when I received a call from our primary bank's business accounts manager, a woman I'd worked with for years on routine matters. She asked if I could come in for a meeting about the company's accounts. And when I arrived at the branch the next morning, she closed her office door and told me that Malcolm had been moving funds between accounts in patterns that had triggered their fraud monitoring systems. She couldn't give me specific details because of privacy regulations, but she said the bank was considering freezing the accounts pending an internal investigation, and she wanted to know if I, as assistant operations manager, had any knowledge of the transactions. I told her honestly that I didn't, that Malcolm had cut me out of financial oversight months ago, and she nodded slowly and said I should document that in writing in case there were legal proceedings. I left the bank in a fog, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I drove back to the flagship store, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was standing at the edge of a collapse I couldn't prevent. I spent the rest of that day pulling together every piece of documentation I had access to: emails, reports, vendor communications, payroll records, and I compiled them into a single encrypted file that I backed up to 3 separate locations. I didn't know yet what I would do with the information, but I knew that when the walls came down, I didn't want to be caught in the rubble without evidence of what I'd tried to prevent. That evening, after the stores closed, I asked Malcolm for a private meeting in his office. I told him about the bank's concerns, about Vernon's unanswered lease letters, about the vendors who were threatening to cut us off, and I said we needed to bring in professional help: a crisis management consultant, a financial advisor, someone with the expertise to stabilize the situation before it spiraled beyond recovery. Malcolm listened in silence, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he asked me if I'd been talking to people outside the company about our internal matters. I said I'd only talked to the bank manager because she'd contacted me directly, and he stood up from his desk and told me I was undermining his authority, that I'd crossed a line from management into insubordination, and that I was suspended pending a review of my conduct. I went home that night, barely able to process what had happened, the unfairness of it burning in my chest like acid, and I spent hours staring at my laptop screen, trying to decide my next move. The ethical path seemed clear. I needed to report what I knew to someone with authority to act, but the practical implications were terrifying. If I went public or contacted regulators, I could be blacklisted in the industry, labeled a disloyal troublemaker, and Malcolm had enough connections in the local business community to make my professional life very difficult. But if I stayed silent, I was complicit in whatever fraud or mismanagement was unfolding, and the people who would suffer most were the hourly employees who had no idea their jobs were built on quicksand. I made my decision over a cup of coffee at 3 in the morning, sitting at my kitchen table with the city lights blinking through the window like distant warnings. My laptop screen cast a pale glow across the scattered papers I'd printed: bank statements, vendor invoices, payroll discrepancies, and I could hear my neighbor's dog barking intermittently through the thin walls, a sound that felt absurdly normal against the magnitude of what I was about to do. The coffee had gone cold in my hands, the ceramic mug losing its warmth the way my certainty about Malcolm had drained away over the past months, and I realized I was gripping it so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I set it down carefully on a water ring it had already made, watched my fingers tremble as I opened my email client. And I understood in that moment that there was no version of this story where I remained unscathed. The only choice was between which kind of damage I could live with. I drafted an email to the District Chamber of Commerce's ethics hotline, attaching the financial documentation I'd compiled and outlining my concerns about payroll irregularities, vendor payment failures, and Malcolm's refusal to address mounting evidence of mismanagement. I also sent a copy to the State Labor Board, flagging the payroll delays as potential wage violations, and I carbon copied my personal attorney with a note asking him to preserve the records in case of future litigation. I hit send at 3:47 a.m., and then I sat in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise, knowing that I'd just ignited a fuse I couldn't extinguish. The suspension lasted less than 12 hours. Malcolm called me at noon the next day and told me not to bother coming back. that I was terminated effective immediately for violating confidentiality agreements and undermining company interests. I asked him to clarify what confidentiality I'd violated, and he hung up on me. 20 minutes later, I received an email from the company's HR contractor. Malcolm had never maintained an in-house HR department, with a formal termination letter that cited gross insubordination and unauthorized disclosure of proprietary business information. The letter also included a thinly veiled threat about legal action if I continued to spread false or damaging claims about the company. I forwarded the entire exchange to my attorney, and then I allowed myself exactly 10 minutes to sit on my couch and feel the full weight of what I'd just lost: my income, my professional identity, and 6 years of investment in a company I'd genuinely believed in. But I didn't have the luxury of extended grief, because within 48 hours, the chain reaction I'd triggered began to accelerate beyond anything I'd anticipated. The Labor Board opened an investigation based on my complaint, and they sent an auditor to the flagship store to review payroll records and interview staff. Malcolm predictably refused to cooperate, claiming the investigation was baseless and politically motivated, but his refusal only deepened the board's scrutiny. Meanwhile, the Chamber of Commerce forwarded my ethics complaint to a business conduct review panel, which had the authority to revoke membership and recommend regulatory action to state authorities. The news spread through the local business community like a virus, and suddenly, Malcolm's once sterling reputation was a topic of whispered speculation at networking events and industry meetups. The vendors, sensing blood in the water, moved swiftly. Our footwear distributor pulled the credit line entirely, demanding cash on delivery for any future orders, and 2 other major suppliers followed suit within the same week. Without credit terms, Malcolm couldn't stock inventory, and without inventory, the stores couldn't generate revenue, and the whole fragile ecosystem began to implode. I heard about it through former colleagues who texted me updates, their messages oscillating between anger at Malcolm and fear for their own jobs. One of them, a floor manager named Kevin, who'd always been fiercely loyal to Malcolm, sent me a message that said simply, "You were right. It's falling apart." In late August, Vernon, the landlord, filed an eviction notice for the flagship location, citing non-payment of rent for 2 consecutive months. The notice was posted on the front door of the store in full view of customers and staff, a humiliating public declaration that the company was in default. Malcolm responded by moving most of his operations to the second location, effectively abandoning the flagship. But that strategy collapsed when the landlord for the second location, spooked by the eviction news, demanded 3 months advance rent as a condition of continuing the lease. Malcolm couldn't produce the money, and within a week, that location was also facing eviction proceedings. The staff exodus, which had begun as a trickle in June, became a flood. By early September, more than 2/3 of the workforce had resigned, many of them taking jobs with competitors who were happy to poach experienced retail talent from a failing company. The few employees who remained did so out of desperation or misplaced loyalty, and their morale was shattered. I ran into Iris, the former second location manager, at a coffee shop one afternoon, and she told me the atmosphere in the stores was like a wake, everyone just waiting for the inevitable closure announcement. She also told me that Malcolm had started blaming me publicly for the company's problems, telling staff and vendors that I'd sabotaged the business out of spite after being fired. The accusation was so absurd, it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so damaging to my reputation. The financial unraveling reached its climax in mid-September, when a local business journalist published an investigative piece about Malcolm's company, citing anonymous sources. former employees, and vendors who described a pattern of financial mismanagement, payroll manipulation, and possible fund diversion. The article stopped short of making criminal accusations, but it painted a damning picture of a business owner who'd prioritized ego and control over operational sustainability. The piece went viral in local business circles, shared and reshared on social media, and Malcolm's attempts to refute it only made things worse. He posted a rambling, defensive statement on the company's social media pages, attacking the journalist's credibility and claiming he was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign. And the post was so unhinged that even his remaining allies began to distance themselves. The State Attorney General's office contacted me on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, and an investigator named Patricia Voss asked if I'd be willing to come in for an interview about Malcolm's business practices. I met her 2 days later in a bland conference room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, the kind of government space designed to intimidate through its very sterility. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed and methodical, and she spent 3 hours walking me through the timeline I'd documented: payroll delays, vendor defaults, fund transfers, Malcolm's escalating obstruction. She asked me about specific transactions, names of suppliers, dates of conversations, and I provided everything I had, watching her take notes in tight, precise handwriting. At the end of the interview, she looked up from her notepad and said, "You understand, you may be called to testify if this proceeds to charges." I nodded, and she studied my face for a moment before adding, "Most people don't stick their necks out like this. They just leave." I told her I'd thought about leaving, but that the people who didn't have the option to leave deserved better. She didn't respond, just nodded once and thanked me for my cooperation. The Labor Board investigation ran parallel to the AG's inquiry, and by October, both agencies had expanded their scope. The Labor Board was now examining potential misclassification of employees and unreported overtime across all 3 locations, while the AG's office was building a case around possible fraud and fund diversion. Malcolm hired a criminal defense attorney, which only fueled speculation that he was facing serious legal jeopardy, and the business community that had once celebrated him began treating him like a pariah. I was contacted by investigators twice more, providing additional documentation and testimony, and each time I left those meetings with a mix of vindication and exhaustion. In early October, the flagship store closed permanently, the doors locked and the windows dark, and a commercial real estate sign appeared in the parking lot advertising the space for lease. I drove past it one evening and saw the interior through the glass, empty display racks casting skeletal shadows, the alarm system's red light still blinking faithfully in the corner, that electronic persistence guarding nothing. The second location followed 2 weeks later, shuttered after the landlord won a summary eviction judgment in court. The third location, the smallest of the 3 and located in a strip mall on the outskirts of town, limped along for another month before Malcolm finally admitted defeat and closed it as well. In less than 4 months, an empire that had taken 6 years to build had been reduced to empty storefronts and legal wreckage. The criminal investigation eventually concluded in November without charges. The AG's office determined that while Malcolm's financial management had been reckless and possibly unethical, there wasn't sufficient evidence of intentional fraud to pursue prosecution. But the civil consequences were severe. He faced multiple lawsuits from vendors, a class action claim from former employees over unpaid wages and benefits, and a personal bankruptcy filing that wiped out what remained of his assets. The last I heard, he'd moved to another state and was working in an unrelated industry, his retail career effectively over. I attended a mediation session in November as part of the employee class action suit, sitting in a conference room with a dozen former colleagues and listening to Malcolm's attorney try to negotiate a settlement that would minimize his liability. Malcolm himself sat at the far end of the table, hunched and diminished, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. At one point, his attorney suggested that the company's failure had been the result of unforeseen market conditions and that Malcolm had been a victim of circumstances beyond his control. I watched several people around the table shake their heads in disgust, and I felt a surge of anger at the attempt to rewrite history, to erase the months of warnings and opportunities for course correction that Malcolm had deliberately ignored. The attorney droned on about liquidation timelines and payment structures, but then Malcolm's voice cut through, quiet and hoarse, in a way I'd never heard before. "I did everything I could," he said, not looking up from the table, and the words landed like stones in water. Brief ripples of shock before Kevin muttered bullshit under his breath, and the mediator had to call for order. That was all Malcolm said, that single deflection, but it told me everything I needed to know about whether he had learned anything from the wreckage he'd created. During a break in the mediation, I stepped outside for air and found Kevin, the floor manager, who'd once been Malcolm's most vocal defender, leaning against the building with his arms crossed. He looked over at me and said, "I should have listened to you back in June." I told him that loyalty wasn't a character flaw, that Malcolm had been skilled at manipulating people's best instincts, and Kevin laughed bitterly and said loyalty had cost him 4 months of unpaid wages and a gap in his resume that made him look unemployable. We stood there in silence for a while, two people who'd invested years in a venture that had imploded not because of market forces or bad luck, but because one man had refused to accept reality until it was too late. The settlement, when it finally came through in December, was a fraction of what the employees were owed, structured as a percentage payout over 3 years and contingent on Malcolm's ability to generate income in his new career. Most of the former staff accepted it because the alternative was years of litigation with no guarantee of a better outcome, but the dissatisfaction was palpable. I took my settlement check, a sum that barely covered 2 months of the wages I'd lost, and I deposited it with a sense of bitter closure. In the months that followed, I processed the experience through a lens of systemic failure rather than personal vendetta. Malcolm's collapse wasn't just the story of one man's hubris. It was a case study in how toxic leadership, unchecked authority, and the absence of meaningful oversight could destroy an organization from within. The people who'd tried to warn him, me, Denise the bookkeeper, concerned managers, anxious vendors, had all been dismissed or silenced, and the employees who depended on the company for their livelihoods had paid the price for his refusal to listen. I eventually found work with a consulting firm that specialized in business turnaround and crisis management, a position that valued my willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, but the process of rebuilding my professional reputation was slow and exhausting. I saw Malcolm one final time in March, 9 months after he'd fired me in that parking lot. I was leaving a coffee shop in the downtown district, and he was walking in, and we nearly collided in the doorway. He stopped, his hand on the door handle, and for 3 seconds we just stood there, close enough that I could see the fatigue in his face, the weight he'd lost, the way his expensive coat hung differently on his frame. Neither of us spoke. I stepped aside, he walked past without acknowledgement, and I continued to my car with my heart pounding harder than the encounter warranted. It was the smallest possible confrontation, barely an interaction at all, but the power reversal was absolute. I was employed, vindicated, moving forward, and he was the one carrying the weight of what he'd destroyed. I returned to the site of the flagship store one final time in early spring, almost a year after my termination. The building had been leased by a fitness franchise, and the renovations were nearly complete, the space utterly transformed. I stood in the parking lot where Malcolm had fired me, the memory still sharp, but no longer quite so raw, and I thought about the question that had haunted me since that morning. Was I wrong to push this far? The answer, I'd come to believe, was that I'd been wrong to wait so long, to prioritize Malcolm's comfort and my own job security over the welfare of the people who depended on the company's stability. The real error hadn't been speaking up. It had been the months of hesitation before I finally did. I thought about Malcolm sometimes, wondered if he'd learned anything from the wreckage of his empire, or if he'd simply found new ways to blame others for his failures. I thought about the employees who'd scattered to other jobs, carrying the scars of financial instability and broken trust. And I thought about the system that had allowed one man's pathology to metastasize for so long without effective intervention. The structural gaps that made it possible for workers to be exploited and vendors to be cheated until the inevitable collapse. The story didn't have a clean ending. No moment of redemptive justice or satisfying accountability, just the grinding reality of consequences distributed unevenly across people with vastly different levels of power and protection. Jury, leave your verdict below. Verdict justified or verdict unfair. Subscribe to join the jury. Tomorrow, another case awaits your judgment.